application. The applicant shall have 3 additional minutes for closing testimony if requested. We will then ask to hear for supporters from the request. We will then ask to hear from supporters opponents of the request. We will then ask to hear from anyone else who wishes to speak on the request. Testimony shall be limited to 3 minutes unless additional time is granted by the commission. City staff will then make their recommendation on the request. In order to reduce the time necessary to hear an application, references to printed material, including staff reports and applicable findings, shall not be read into the record unless directed by the commission. The commission will close testimony from the floor. The commission will then discuss the proposal and publicly make its determination with reasons. The form of the motion shall be positive, that is, the motion shall be made to accept the request as presented or with modifications, stipulations, or conditions. A final vote will be taken with ayes in favor and nays opposed. The chairman shall announce the results of the vote, specifying the number of votes cast in favor and the number of votes cast against. The following are documents entered as exhibits for all items under consideration at this meeting: the City Code of the City of Jefferson as amended, the Comprehensive Plan and Land Use Map, copies of applications under consideration, a list of property owners to whom notices were sent, the affidavit of publication of the public notice in the newspaper, copies of drawings, plans, and or renderings under consideration, letters or memoranda from staff, staff reports, minutes of proceedings, correspondence or other materials submitted by the public or the applicant, rules of procedure for the City of Jefferson Planning and Zoning Commission. These items are public record and available for inspection in the Department of Planning and Protective Services or through the Office of the City Clerk. Please be advised that any items that are presented, distributed, or otherwise received pertaining to these cases under consideration become property of the Commission. This includes photographs, drawings, petitions, and letters. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ian. We'll move on to the adoption of the agenda. When the Commission's ready, we'll entertain a motion to move forward with tonight's agenda.
I move to adopt the agenda as presented.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All in favor? All opposed? Fliver? That's a new one. All in favor? Okay. Motion carries. Eric, have we received any communications regarding tonight?
No, we have not.
Okay. Well, look who's here just in time. We always need you. Okay, before we start the agenda item, Bunny, we will have you voting this evening. So just wanted to let you know, Hank, as they said down there, sorry. New business and public hearings. We do have case number P18022, the South Side Neighborhood Rezoning. It is a rezoning from RA-2 to RS-4. Eric, I believe you're going to present that to us this evening.
Yes, and is this on? Yes.
I think so.
And I'll do it from the podium this evening. I do have a bit of a presentation to give you some background, some of the stuff that we look at whenever processing a major neighborhood rezoning plan. So this case is for the Southside neighborhood rezoning. It's something that we've presented to you from time to time regarding the Southside neighborhood plan, the old Munichburg Southside neighborhood plan that was recently adopted by this body. So this is just a list of things just to give you an idea of the format of my presentation, some of the things I was going to go through. First is just kind of to reiterate the Southside plan, point out a few things on it, but not go into great depth on it. Some of the land use recommendations that are contained in that plan. The staff implementation plan, there's a number of rezoning actions that are associated with that plan, so give you an idea on what our rezoning plan for the Southside neighborhood is. The specifics behind this rezoning proposal, so we've called it rezoning number 1 for the Southside area. And then some of the impacts that this rezoning would have on properties, and the timeline, some of the other dates associated with this proposal. So I'll get right into it. The Historic Southside Old Munichburg District Neighborhood Plan was a plan that was originally commissioned by Capital Region Medical Center. They hired a consulting firm, planning firm, to come in and do a neighborhood plan for the area surrounding the hospital. And they really focused on the entire Old Munichburg Southside area. And they were not focusing on the hospital, and basically were doing the same thing that would have been done had the city hired a consultant to come in and do the same study. And so it was kind of like getting corporate sponsorship almost for a city neighborhood plan. They went through an extensive public involvement process, what we would typically see for a major planning study. They interviewed a number of different stakeholders, both in the neighborhood and across the community. They had a number of public workshops, formed some focus groups, and an advisory committee. And over 120 people participated in this planning process. It's a little too small to read, but over on the right-hand side is a list of public meetings that were associated with this plan. The Planning and Zoning Commission adopted the plan in July of last year. So this is really kind of the major page out of that plan. It kind of identifies a number of different elements that are contained in the plan. The plan has recommendations on a wide variety of things, everything from greenways and landscaping, trying to make the Highway 50 at the north side of the neighborhood look a little better, basically, with ideas of landscaping and making it a little bit more walkable, a little bit more crossable. Strengthening the commercial core at Old Munichburg, so the old street front style buildings on Dunklin Street, basically at between Madison and Jefferson or so, and improving the housing stock in the area, expanding some of the housing choices. There's a variety of different housing recommendations in the area, some multifamily, some single family. Establishing a community development corporation. This is an item that some of the business leaders within this neighborhood are pushing on separate from this body, but trying to get a community development corporation, a not-for-profit, so to speak, to kind of be a champion for that neighborhood and push forward projects with not-for-profit or private funding in order to pursue some of the recommendations of the plan. Improving streetscapes, throughout the neighborhood, but also along specifically along some of the major streets, with some specific recommendations on two-waying Monroe Street and a few of the other major corridors in the area. And then some specific plans for certain areas, specifically around Lincoln University, again, the Old Munichburg area, some, trying to encourage the storefront, old style of building, and some park recommendations, particularly in some of the floodplain areas. The Southside plan did include a land use plan, as many neighborhood plans do, and so this is the page out of that. So there's a variety of different land use recommendations contained on this page. The land use key is there in the bottom right-hand corner. I'll point out a few. I got to choose which side to point at. I guess I'll point over here. But some of the Dunklin Street area located right there, again, is a dark red, really a storefront commercial type of use. Surrounding that, some of the dark yellow or almost orange is a multifamily type of recommendation. Over here on Broadway Street is a mixed use, light retail type, an office recommendation, with the bright red commercial recommendations along Highway 50. There's of course a lot of blue, that's institutional type uses. Again, there's a lot of institutional uses, including Lincoln University, the Jeff City High School, Capital Region Medical Center, and some other schools in the area. That own property in the area, so it's an institutional type of recommendation there. But the area that we're really focusing on first in terms of zoning is this light yellow area, where a lot of the areas, built out as single-family residential neighborhoods are being recommended to, again, continue that use. And of course, the purpose of this coming before you is that the zoning does not match this land use plan. And so city staff have, one of the pages within the plan is an implementation schedule. Now, the implementation of the Southside Plan stretches out for 20 years. It's kind of a typical planning process, planning horizon for these long-range city plans. But one of the recommendations on the first things to take care of is to complete the zoning district revision. So pursue these rezoning actions within the neighborhood. And so that's what we're attempting to do at the staff level, is to start rezoning where the plan conflicts with the existing zoning map. And so we've laid out an implementation plan. 5 different areas that we've identified that basically need to be rezoned in order to match the intended land use. They're not in any particular order, but it is number 1 that we're here to speak about this evening, the blue area. And so this is a blow up of that portion of the neighborhood on the land use plan page out of the Southside Plan, with a blue line highlighting the boundaries of the area that we're proposing for rezoning. So the existing zoning of that area is an RA2, a multifamily residential zoning district. Of course, the plan recommending a single family. And so that's the excerpt of the zoning map showing the same boundaries on top. One might ask, how did the multifamily come to exist in this area? So we went back and did a bit of a history lesson looking at previous zoning plans. And so all the way back to the 1932 zoning map, this is the first zoning map that was, that the city adopted. And so I've tried to outline the neighborhood in blue there on each one of these screens. And so the zoning regulations have changed over time. Going through different versions of zoning codes, different ways of regulating that land use. But in general, they're fairly comparable in terms of single family, multifamily, different types of districts. And so back in 1932, the southern part of this area, the area outlined in blue, the polka dotted area shown on the map, of course all maps were black and white back then, it was zoned single family. That's a single family designation, whereas the northern part was actually zoned a 4-family, so a higher level of zoning. In 1945, that basically it changed a little bit, with the southern part of that neighborhood being a switch from single family to a duplex zoning, so a 2-unit residential zoning. The 1945 plan was referred to as the post-war plan. And so after World War II, they went through toward the end of World War II, put together a post-war plan for Jefferson City, and this is the zoning portion of it. In 1972, again, the ordinances changed. The zoning ordinances have changed over time. The entire area was zoned in RA. There was only one level of RA zoning, just straight residential apartment. And then 1996, at some point that had changed, the regulations, the zoning code had been split between 2 different levels of residential apartment, 1 and 2. With this area being designated as RA2, and that has persisted to today. And so basically that RA2 zoning was largely established in the early 70s. Okay, prior to that, there were still different levels of multifamily in the area at the time, but dating back to original construction, a good portion of the area was zoned single family. And so the the zoning of Jefferson City, with with the downtown being zoned a C3 commercial, downtown commercial, and a lot of the areas surrounding it being a lower level of commercial at C2 or even a C1 commercial, and then a lot of the residential neighborhoods around that having an RA, a multifamily zoning, is kind of reminiscent of what I'll refer to as a concentric zone theory of planning, a theory of urban planning that really dates back to about the 70s, where there's various rings of density, and the further out from the circle you get, the lower density you get. It's kind of an outdated model. However, our zoning map is still largely based on that, with large portions of neighborhoods having a higher level of residential zoning than they were necessarily built for, with multifamily zoning being on top of predominantly single-family neighborhoods. This is one example of that area. Going back to the the implementation map, area number 2 is another example that we would be potentially bringing forward at a later date. But there are other areas, including portions of the central east, the east side neighborhoods east of downtown, and then also west of downtown. So prior to bringing this rezoning proposal forward, we did a land use study of this neighborhood. Basically went through and did a survey trying to figure out what the existing land use is for each of the properties within the area, and some just outside the area. And so up on the screen is the results of that survey. To point out some of the different colors here, the green are properties that were identified as single-family residences. Okay. The red are properties that were identified as being built originally as single-family residences, but having been converted to multiple units, most of them duplex, most of them 2-unit conversions, at some time in the past. And so, currently in use as a multiple unit. I think all but one of them, I think, are 2-unit type conversions. Some of the other colors, what is it, a light blue? I'll point at some of them up here on the screen. Located right there, over there. That's a 4-unit, so a fourplex that was built as a fourplex, I believe. Or not necessarily built as a fourplex, but in use as a fourplex, okay? There's a couple of them over here. And then the purple is a triplex. So there's a couple of them scattered in this area. And then the blue are buildings that are in use as a 2-unit building, but they were built as a duplex. So they differ from the red in that the structure was built as a 2-unit residential structure rather than having been converted to one. And so the thing that I'd like to point out on this screen is that within the area, within the boundaries of the proposed rezoning, the predominant use is single-family residential, is green. There are, of course, a number of structures that have been converted. All but one of those we identified as being a 2-unit conversion. That's important, and I'll describe that here in a few minutes. The one that we identified as 3 units is this one right here, and I believe it might be vacant. Again, that's important as well. Skip over that one, but back. So the proposal, so the specific rezoning proposal is to rezone that area from an RA2 to an RS4, a single-family residential zoning district. There are different levels of single-family district: RS1, RS2, RS3, and RS4. The RS4 is the density level most appropriate for this neighborhood. It's what you typically see the older neighborhoods of the city being zoned. The lot sizes and lot widths are more appropriate for the denser areas, the older construction in the city. So that is the proposal, is to rezone all of that area to an RS4. There is a tiny bit, and I'll point it out, of area that's actually zoned C2 right now that's included, and it's basically literally a zoning line crosses a property, so it's got a split zoning right up here that's zoned a C2, a general commercial, and then a portion of this undeveloped area right here. So it's almost all RA2, and it's just that one asterisk associated with the zoning. So what does this mean for the properties in the area? It's for specifically all the properties that were shown as red, the ones that have been converted to multiple units that with a down zoning would become non-conforming within the neighborhood. What does that mean? Well, they would retain their legal status as non-conforming, or grandfathered is the typical term, structures. They could continue to be used as multiple units indefinitely until such time as they are either voluntarily converted to a single-family home, or if they're destroyed by fire, they can be rebuilt as a two-unit structure. There's a specific provision within the zoning code that allows for non-conforming single-family and two-unit residential structures to be rebuilt if destroyed by fire. That's an important thing, especially for obtaining financing on a non-conforming structure. That there is that legal ability to rebuild a structure if it's destroyed by natural causes. The caveat to that is it has to be done within a year, and if it's more than 2 units, again, I think there's only one structure that we identified as being greater than 2, then the replacement structure would, they have no grandfathered right to that if destroyed by fire or natural causes. The replacement structure would have to conform to the zoning. And so going back to the land use map, there's a couple notches within the plan that differ from the south side recommended land use, and I'll point them out. This property right here and this property right here. So the south side plan actually identified this one, which looks like a notch as well, as multifamily, kind of being a continuation of this street corridor that has a number of multifamily in the area. So that's a pretty straightforward recommendation of the plan. But these two areas were shown on the plan as being intended for single family use. And so why are they not being included? The answer to that is basically, yes, it would be ideal to downzone them. However, the property owners would likely have some rather intense difficulty if selling their property because a 4-unit building would not be protected if destroyed by natural causes, by fire. They would basically be unable to obtain financing. An intended buyer of the property would be unable to obtain financing from a bank or someone who's doing a due diligence check on that property. There are things that, of course, staff would keep an eye on over time. If the opportunity presents itself basically to work with the property owners in terms of trying to get those to conform with the recommended land use, but they are the type of land use that would be unprotected by the protections of the zoning code that afforded to 2-unit structures. So staff made the decision basically that it would be a hard thing to include them within the rezoning area for those reasons. We did have a neighborhood meeting, an informational meeting, as we do oftentimes with major rezonings, 1 week ago today, basically to present information on this request. We had about basically three people from the area show up. There's 139 properties contained within the area, and we mailed notices to all those property owners, as well as all of the property owners that are located within 185 feet of the area. With that, I'll just add a little bit to some of the intent on this. You know, on a kind of a staff perspective, the multifamily zoning of this neighborhood is, for many years, basically been in conflict with what it was constructed for. That's kind of the staff position on it. It was constructed primarily for single-family residential use. The structures out there are predominantly still in use as single-family. The various conversions, there are some examples of some very bad conversions, some conversions that have a very high level of negative impact on the surrounding area. While it would be a very long-term type of thing, zoning is a very long-term type of regulation to affect land use. We believe it's the correct zoning for the district, and hope that with its approval, that it would establish some guarantee for future property owners, people that might want to buy a house, to occupy, an owner-occupied home in the area, who right now would have no protections in terms of, the neighboring property either being converted to multiple units or potentially demolished and redeveloped as an apartment type of use, would, after approval of this rezoning plan, would have that guarantee that their surrounding properties that are already in use as single family would continue to be used that way, thereby hopefully reinvigorating some interest in the area in terms of not only owner occupation but investment in terms of upgrading property and making it a better place to live. That's what I have. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have prior to opening the public hearing.
Thank you, Eric. Do any of the commissioners have any questions for Eric? Jack?
Actually, I have two questions. I assume the intent is to have the entire area RS4 or more restrictive, except the obvious that is in the commercial zone, all the way to, I guess, down to Lafayette. Is that correct? Or probably Adams Street, Jackson, Adams? The contiguous areas, we're going to keep marching on trying to get it RS4, correct?
That's
Okay.
so for all of the areas that are shown in that light yellow on this map, basically, a lot of them already are. Some of the areas, again, I'll point at this map, major portions of this neighborhood are already zoned RS4. There's still portions kind of in this area that are zoned RA2. So that would be rezoning number 2.
And my next question is, if the house was destroyed by fire or earthquake or something, and they want to rebuild, are there architectural guidelines, or they can put up just a straight 2-unit apartment there?
There are no architectural guidelines for this area. The only spot, basically 2 spots in town that have basically only one that's in place and has regulations associated with is Capitol Avenue. That's the only place where there are architectural requirements in town, outside of the PUD zoning district. So
the current multifamily units are grandfathered in, and you said that they can use those indefinitely as multifamily units, but if they burn down was one thing, but if they were like to do a remodel or an addition or anything like that, would that cause any?
So
or if they wanted to restructure the floor plan?
I think when that you can go into an existing 2-unit or or multi-unit and do a rehab, a refresh, pull the stuff out, get new stuff in, redo everything. If you were to go in and say completely gut the structure to where you could not walk into and identify there being 2 units, then you're in a situation where you have destroyed its 2-unit nature, and really I think as the definitions in the zoning code go, it's at that point you're doing a structural alteration rather than just an interior renovation. No, I think it's really tied to that structural alteration type of language. So no, it's not a percentage. There are certain percentages tied to expansions of non-conforming structures. So there's certain allowances for minor additions to a non-conforming structure. So.
Excuse my ignorance, but if it was a 2-unit and you could not expand to a 3-unit, correct?
Correct. You could take a 3-unit and downgrade it to a 2-unit because that's viewed as coming closer into compliance with the zoning code. There's kind of a special process associated with that, but yes.
Eric, any other commissioners have any questions? I have one. Eric, you mentioned that the non-conforming or grandfathered use, like Dale mentioned, that anything over a duplex would be not in compliance. Did you mention how many properties within the boundaries you have right now would be that 3-4 multi-use?
We only identified one.
So out of this 130 some acres of rezoning, there's only one?
And I believe it's vacant.
Okay. Then going back to that comment of, and I'm just in awe that Jack didn't question the ins and outs and ups and downs of the boundary lines, but the kind of the 3 indentations, if you want to call it, those are properties that are multifamily, maybe 4-plex or more, and we're not in that plan and kind of were recommended to stay in multifamily zoning?
Two of them were in the plan,
And the
recommended as
two on Jefferson.
single family, the 2 on Jefferson Street. It is a staff position that they not be included for the reasons I stated.
Okay. All right. Any other questions for city staff for Eric at this point? Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
All right. At this point in the meeting, we're going to open up the conversation to the general public. So at this point, we're going to do it in a 3-step process. We're going to ask for those that are in favor, those that are against, and those that would just like to speak. So I'll start with, is there anyone in the audience who'd like to speak in favor of this request? If so, I can speak tonight. If so, please come forward and state your name and address for the record. I'm seeing none. Is there anyone present who would like to speak in opposition to this request? If so, please come forward and state your name and address for the record. Please come forward, sir, and give us your name and address for the record.
Good evening. My name is Mark Borman, and my address is 15114 Deer Run Road, Henley, Missouri. I own property, my wife and I do, at 122 West Atchison, which is just outside of the border of this proposal. I'm here speaking on behalf of my aunt, 86-year-old aunt Eleanor Netwig, who is in the proposed zoning area down on Atchison Street. I'm not used to this many people listening to me at one time, so I grew up in that neighborhood. I've seen the decline. I understand the issues are going on. My aunt's been there for 40 years. She lives in a house that my grandmother built. And sometime in the next probably 2 to 5 years, she's going to have to sell that house. It's a large house. The potential for, in my opinion, the potential of her selling that house to a single family that's going to move in with 5 or 6 kids is not great. That the property has a better potential to be used as an income property, converted into a duplex. At this point, I feel that this zoning is going to cause her harm without any way of no remedy for her. I don't know how much that might be. It may not be a lot. It may be, and it may be a lot. I don't know. But she's going to need that money. Primarily, like I said, she lives on Atchison Street. She has multifamily on both sides of her. She's put up with a lot of baloney over the last 20 years that's gone into the neighborhood. And I just don't think it's fair. I don't have much concern for the stuff that's not on Atchison Street, but in that area right there, there's a lot of rental on that house, on that street. And right across the street that's not in the zoning area, but that affects her property and affects her ability to sell. So I don't know what the answer is, but I don't think that just cutting it off and saying no future multifamily is the answer. Multifamily's not the boogeyman here. It's properties converted to multifamily, and then you have property owners that don't take care of the property. And, you know, maybe the way forward is to work at it from that angle, is to, instead of just saying never again. So, that's probably about all I got to say. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, sir. Don't leave me just yet. We're going to ask if anyone would like to ask you a question. Does anyone have a question for the applicant at this point, or for Mr. Borman at this point? Turn your mic on, please. She's on the paper map there, right next to where it says RA2. Just about where that boundary comes in from the north and hits Atchison Street, right off the corner of Broadway and Atchison, right in between, right there. Boom, that's it.
Okay.
And of course, she's got multifamily on Broadway, which is not in this area, but it affects her property. You know, she's surrounded by, now there's potentially there's not a huge amount of multi-property in the direct area she's of the zoning, but there is all around her that's not in the area of the zoning. And so it's hard to say that, you know, a 60-foot wide street separates that. It doesn't put a wall there. That still affects her. There's commercial property there. So, I mean, I'm not a real estate expert, but common sense tells you that, I mean, it would be great for a family with 4 or 5 kids to move into her house. But I don't know if you want your kids in that neighborhood. I don't know if you want your grandkids in that neighborhood. It's got problems. There's no doubt about it. I don't know that the zoning is going to turn the clock back. So.
Any other questions for Mr. Borman? Thank you, sir. Appreciate your testimony. Is there anyone else in the audience tonight who would like to speak in opposition to this request? If so, please come forward and state your name and address for the record. Okay, I'm seeing none. Lastly, we'll ask, is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak on this request? If so, please come forward and state your name and address for the record.
Good evening. I wasn't planning on speaking, but after this gentleman's comments, I thought I'd share. My name is Laura Ward, and I reside at 115 West Atchison, which is in these this proposed boundary. I am also the city council member of this ward in this area. I will be abstaining from vote when the time comes on this because of my interest in the area. But I just wanted to share that there are individuals coming to this area to live with their children. We did it 7 years ago. When we purchased our home, it had 15 broken out windows, no electric, no heat, no plumbing. It was there, it was all rusted out, 60 amp fuse box, all knob and tube. And we lived there and restored it in the winter of 2011. Since that time, 2 homes next to us, not quite in that bad of condition, but in dire need of restoration, have been purchased by families. One that has 2 young children, and the other one from out of state who are professionals, one working up at MU. So I'm just mentioning this because this is an area that's starting to draw interest from families and from those who don't live in our community, because there is a desire to live in neighborhoods that have diversity, that have architectural character, that has integrity, that doesn't look all the same, that is walkable, a walkable community, a walkable neighborhood. We are beginning to build up Dunklin. There's a lot happening there with festivals, the farmers market, the whole block of Madison. It's starting to improve, and I see this plan as another step in that direction. My only desire is that it would include a little bit more of this area, because you're missing over 50 homes north of West Atchison. And again, if those were to be demolished and multiple family units put in, we would lose the integrity and the architectural character to the whole South Side neighborhood. That's about all I had to add. I just wanted you to know that there is interest and there is people buying in that area. The Historic City of Jefferson donated 20 grand to the city's downtown payment assistance program, and a young couple was able to benefit from that program and bought a house on Washington Street just last year. Another young couple buying in an old neighborhood, a house that needs repair, and it's not included in this area. I also wanted to show too that dividing up a street, I mean, Eric, Mr. Barron mentioned that, you know, a person that buys a home doesn't have a lot of protections if the place next to them is destroyed or rebuilt into multiple family. Well, the same is true of one on the other side of the street. So all of West Atchison that's divided up, you know, all those homes above there aren't protected either. So those are just my thoughts. Do you have any questions?
Any questions for Ms. Ward? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Again, I will ask if there's anyone in the audience who would like to speak on this request. If so, please come forward. Seeing none, I will close public testimony.
Can I ask staff a question?
I think that'd be fine. Yeah.
When will this area be included in this water talk about?
I was going to try to respond to that. So.
All right, Eric, we will let you, now that open testimony is closed, we'll let you give a staff report and address the items you want to.
Okay, thank you. First, to try to address broadly some of the issues in the neighborhood. This is only one piece of you know, a long-term basically plan to improve the area. You know, there are other pieces such as code enforcement, making sure property owners remain responsible for the upkeep of their property. infrastructure improvement type programs, especially streetscape and sidewalk type programs. There are some specific recommendations on two-waying Monroe Street, and improving streetscapes along Dunkland, but also in general in the rest of the area. There housing type programs such as the Community Development Block Grant Program, are targeted toward trying to rehabilitate houses, especially in the older areas of town. That's what a lot of our, the city's CDBG, planning. It gets a certain allocation of money from the federal government every year. A lot of it is kind of directed in that area. And so there's a number of different things that really need to come together for a neighborhood such as this to be improved. And it's a very long-term type of project. The zoning is just one piece. Regarding some of the recommendations on including more area, if you'll recall, several months ago, I forget the exact date, I believe it was in the May, June type, or April, May type time frame, when we were presenting the early kind of thinking on this plan, that staff and myself came in front of this body with basically inclination to expand the area, to look at the recommendations of that South Side plan and start taking a harder look at this area, which is identified as multifamily, residential on this plan. But going back to that land use map, has a lot of the green that single family uses. There are a couple streets in particular that at the staff level we looked at and we think, well, this is a single family street. It probably needs to remain that way. Particularly some of the houses along here, which are right across the street from areas that would be included in there, and particularly along Broadway, especially this row of houses right here that have very, very deep front yards, and only one building basically out of that 2 half-block stretches there that's not a single family. We were looking at taking a closer look at that area, incorporating some zoning recommendations with this rezoning. Then I think 2 months later I came back before you and said, well, we've really had to back off on that it will have to be a separate planning project. It's already 140 properties to follow the recommendations of this plan. It's already one of the largest rezoning projects that the city has undertaken. It simply would be too much to start looking outside the area. It would be our intent at the staff level to take a harder look at that area. It is complicated. I know I keep switching back between these two maps, but because there are a number of buildings that were built as multifamily residential and very appropriate, I believe, for the area, that have an older style and add some character to the area. And so we've preliminarily taking a look at that would basically result in kind of a patchwork quilt type of zoning plan, where we look at individual streetscapes and properties and try to come up with a zoning plan appropriate for that neighborhood, something that does not create any or very few non-conforming situations. So it's respectful of the existing property uses, but at the same time establishes something a little bit in terms of protecting areas that are single family, that area and this area and some others. We have not done that. It would take some time to do that. That would be a fairly major undertaking by staff, but it is something that we intend to look at and hope to bring back to you at a future date. With that, I hope I've addressed a lot of the comments that were voiced. We did put together a staff report for this proposal. It's very short. It was handed out to you this evening. It has just a very brief type of overview of the case. And the staff recommendation is for approval of the proposed rezoning with the recommended form of motion at the bottom of a sheet there. With that, I'd be happy to answer any other questions you may have.
Eric, I'd like to make a comment, maybe in all fairness, and wearing the two hats here and a former planner's hat, is one of the things that maybe has not been brought up this evening is even with the zoning at RA2, if it was left alone, properties that would want to convert to a multifamily use, whether it be a duplex or more, would come underneath code enforcement as well as zoning enforcement, primarily code enforcement, so that if we have a property that's currently single family and someone wants to convert it into a duplex, threeplex, fourplex, whatever, that city staff would get involved with the building permit. And as part of that is all the code requirements would have to be met for health, safety, welfare, as well as things like parking and things like that. So maybe, you know, going back quite a few years, you know, things just happened. A lot of communities had that where people just converted stuff and nobody said a whole lot or whatever. But these days we don't do that. And so just as another point of interest to say, you know, what is maybe a better opportunity for the area, bring it into compliance with a single family zoning district, but if it was left as multifamily, they may not have been converted anyway. And it's really a hard case-by-case basis on each property. And I know as city staff, you couldn't sit here and say out of the 135 properties, what could have been done. But I just wanted to bring that to the commissioner's, you know, interest and, you know, bring it out loud that just because it's zoned multifamily doesn't mean you could really go multifamily with it. Fair statement?
That is correct. It is a very expensive endeavor to conform to modern codes when converting a structure. Involves strict fire separation between units, so certain building code requirements between the units. It's often difficult to retrofit a single-family home for that type of thing. Involves parking. The parking standards have increased over time. Many years ago, there was only a 1 car per apartment requirement. Today, there is a 2 car per apartment requirement, so it would involve construction of paved parking in most cases. And in terms of how often it is done, it is actually fairly rare. In my time here, I've been here about a dozen years, I recall only one case where an existing single family was converted to multiple units. You know, that's looking back a long time. I could be incorrect, but that is my recollection. You know, you might ask why bother with rezoning at that point. Again, it's a while it might be a rare thing to actually occur, a rezoning would establish that certainty to future property owners and current property owners that the long-term plan for their neighborhood is single family, and that they are guaranteed that by the zoning code of the city.
Fair enough. Any other questions or comments for city staff? All right, seeing none, would someone like to make a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move to approve the rezoning plan for the area as presented by staff.
I'll second that motion.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed. The motion carries 8-0. It will be forwarded to the city council. Once again, that will be a public hearing. Eric, do you know when the city council meeting will be?
Oh.
I think it was on your list, wasn't it?
Yes.
October 1st?
This will be forwarded to the city council. There will be a public hearing in front of that body on Monday, October 1st at 6 p.m. And that public hearing will take place in this room.
Very good. So if you'd like to come to that meeting, the city council would love to see you. We will move on. Other business, Eric.
We have no other business on the list.
Thank think you did mention with Ian that we do have a case, at least one case for next month.
There is one case for next month. It is a preliminary PUD plan.
Okay, very good.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
before we adjourn,
Yes.
I have a question for staff. What was the procedure for going to city council with a different recommendation than with the sign ordinance and what we passed as an amendment? What is that procedure?
Okay.
And I would really like to know, not verbally, but where I can look it up and just see how that works. Because if that's so, I mean, sometimes I think, why are we here if it can just be go over our head no matter what we vote?
Well, and so I think it's easier to address specifically. And at the last month's meeting, I did report to this body that staff went with some recommendations that were different from what the Planning and Zoning Commission recommendations were on the sign code bill. Of course, it was greater than 30-page bill. There's a lot of stuff contained within it. Planning and Zoning Commission voted to make some specific changes within that bill, specifically for temporary signs on residential property. Okay, and so that the bill was redrafted and was sent to the City Council in its in a form as the Planning and Zoning Commission recommended. And so staff did consult with the sponsor of the bill and went to the council with a staff recommendation that was different from the Planning and Zoning Commission's vote, their recommendation.
So that's standard procedure? Without any deliberate...
And with that, I'd defer to the attorneys. It is our responsibility to provide professional recommendations, of course, not only to this body, but also to the City Council.
It is responsibility of the citizens of the community to vote what they feel best is for their community, not what staff feels best.
Okay, if there's something specifically on this, Mr. Deacon, I'd be happy to talk to you after the meeting.
No, this is, I want this to be...
Okay, it was not changed by staff. And it was done in a very open forum and setting. And it was, I did report to the Planning and Zoning Commission at their meeting, which happened to take place between the introduction of the bill at the City Council and when the substitute was placed on the agenda. So it was very open. So my apologies if you feel affronted by it, but it was done in a very open format. It was described to the council that the staff recommendation was different from the Planning and Zoning Commission recommendation, and ultimately they voted the same way as the Planning and Zoning Commission, and so ultimately it was the Planning and Zoning Commission's recommendation that was voted by the council. So.
But my point being is, what is the statute for overriding what we present to the council? Is that a normal thing?
It can be, yes. The staff does not have to come to the council with the same recommendation as the Planning and Zoning Commission. It can be a different recommendation. You know, again, it can be for different reasons. And so it was a staff recommendation that there be some sort of limit in this specific case on the number of signs that, you know, that was a recommendation by staff to the council. Ultimately, they decided not to go that direction. So,
Eric, I would ask the question, trying to be fair, if this commission votes a certain way on an agenda item and it's taken to the City Council in a different form, is the council always going to be made aware of that, where once again you would say, okay, the Planning and Zoning Commission voted this way on this agenda item, city staff is proposing it to you this way? Will they always know about that up front in the open, that there's two different scenarios going here. Planning and zoning scenario, city staff scenario.
That is correct. And in general, the bills are crafted based on the Planning and Zoning Commission recommendation. So, for example, PUD plans are probably the most common type of thing where there might be conditions attached to them by this body based on, you know, testimony and things like that, as well as staff recommendations. So those get incorporated into the bill. In general, that is the operating procedure that we go through, and so that's exactly what took place in this case. It's just that on top of that, there was a recommendation to change that on from the staff.
Any other comments or questions about this?
I'd like to just point out that I do remember whenever the recommendation was brought up before it was presented to planning and zoning that there was going to be a limit on sorry, thought that was off. So I do remember that that was made public to us and not just in the paper.
Okay, any other business we need to go over this evening? If not, I will consider the meeting adjourned. Thank you all for coming this evening. Been a hot summer. We're wearing some systems out, I can tell you that.